Before the Declaration of Human Rights was established in 1948, humans were fighting for rights as simple as being able to vote and the opportunity of employment, especially women and humans of color. The history of this era makes me very excited to be discussing one of the most influential political figures of all time who spent the majority of her life working against this discrimination. Without the work of the iconic former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights would not have been crafted, leaving America to remain in justice, and who knows how long it would have taken for the legislation to be made. To reward her nobility, she even received a United Nations prize in the field of human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was born here in New York City on October 11, 1884. Her family was financially stable, which made part of her upbringing easy, although her parents' marriage was very troubled. Her mother, Anna Rebecca Hall, died in 1892 from diphtheria, and her father, Elliot Roosevelt, died 2 short years later from suffering of alcoholism and narcotic addiction. This caused Eleanor to be an orphan by age 10, which is a very difficult way to start childhood, although it did mold her to be strong and independent, and soon powerful. Eleanor attended Allenswood Girls' Academy in London, England from 1898 until 1902. The woman who ran the school, Marie Sauvestre, was soon identified as Eleanor's greatest influence on her educational and emotional development. Her education in London ended at age 18, so she returned to New York City and began her social reform work. She served as a volunteer teacher for impoverished immigrant children at the Manhattan's Rivington Street Settlement House, and she also joined the National Consumers League, whose mission was to end unsafe working conditions and labor practices in factories and other businesses. Some other information that I think is very important to share is that Eleanor was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, and as a niece to a president in the US, she was taught the importance of organized political reform and the process necessary to legally effect fair labor practices. This soon helped her with her own reform and her own discussions. She married Franklin Roosevelt, her 5th cousin once removed, in 1905, and Franklin became president in 1933. This made Eleanor the first lady in the White House. The pair had 6 children together, and 5 of them survived adulthood. I will move on to discuss the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt's life. Eleanor was an early champion of civil rights for African Americans, as well as an influential advocate for women, American workers, the poor, and young people. She was very respected in the political world because she made a name for herself outside of her title as First Lady. Though she never held elected office, the wife of President FDR is widely considered to be the most influential First Lady ever. And although she did support her husband and accompanied him on his institutions and programs, she had her own opinion and actively disagreed with him on several formal occasions. She also encouraged her husband to appoint more women to federal positions. She held hundreds of her own press conferences for female reporters at a time when women were typically not allowed to attend White House press conferences. Additionally, from 1946 to 1953, Roosevelt served as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations, where she oversaw the drafting and passage of the Universal Human Declaration of Rights. She also wrote a syndicated newspaper column titled My Day from December 1935 until shortly before her death in 1962. Eleanor was most famous for speaking honorably at several discussions in hope to obtain proper civil rights. For example, she spoke at the Democratic National Convention, She spoke at the Carnegie Hall in New York City. She spoke at the Sorbonne in Paris. She had several radio discussions, including ones in French, and she was even one of the first people to appear on national television, where, of course, she dedicated it to discussing human rights. My question now becomes, what did Eleanor Roosevelt not do? It is clear that Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge distribution towards the Civil Rights Act. She used rhetorical skills through her career as a tool to determine her credibility. She did an excellent job using ethos, logos, and pathos through her discussions and speeches as well. Ethos is described as the Greek word for character, and Eleanor never failed to demonstrate her credibility. She reflected a universal understanding of citizens' rights and responsibilities that challenged gendered boundaries of public and private spaces during the 1940s. Eleanor never failed to prove that her work was for the benefit of people, which showed her honorable character. Now, logos is the appeal of knowledge and being able to convince your audience with reason. Eleanor demonstrated this by all of the work she had done for the civil rights community and through her delegations to the United Nations. It was clear in her speeches that she knew what she was talking about because she was demonstrating it in her everyday life. Now, pathos is the Greek word for experience, and it is also known as the emotional appeal that a speaker draws to their audience. Roosevelt would use specific tone to emphasize words like freedom and our nation to keep her audience fully engaged. For example, in her speech on the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor engaged the people by using personal reference aside from delegations and commissions that were being discussed. She said, "But we know that we have to work together and we have to progress. So we believe that when we have made a good fight and the majority is against us, it is perhaps better tactics to try to cooperate." Now, phrases like these really showed the world that Eleanor was working for the people, which drew an emotional connection to her work and to her speeches. These achievements combined with her family background shows very much honor and very much strength. From being a niece of the president and then the first lady, this also added to her credibility since she was a political figure. Now, another factor that was very noticeable through Eleanor's speeches are her facial expressions and voice. In her discussions, she would constantly smile and show enthusiasm on her topic. For example, when she spoke for a TV program on Human Rights Day Archival in 1948, she began her speech by saying, "I am very glad to be able to take part in this celebration on Human Rights Day." See, Roosevelt never failed to share her enthusiasm, which again added to her credibility. But when a more serious debate was in topic, for example, on the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a much more intense deliberation, her voice altered to a more serious tone, as did the audience, did the discussion, and she was very good at matching what needed to be said with what was delivered. You see, there are endless reasons as to why Eleanor Roosevelt is significant in civil rights history. She was a radical feminist, and she began her social work as early as age 18. She was active in Women's Union Trade League, the League of Women Voters. She worked for civil rights towards African Americans and efforts to rescue those fleeing the ravages of World War II in Europe. These are only a few examples. She spoke and wrote with integrity and passion, and I believe without Eleanor Roosevelt, there would have been a much more difficult process into receiving our human rights. Also, I want to mention, again, when her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, was elected as president in 1933, she took this as an advantage to continue with her organizations and movements. When speaking in regards of her husband, according to Book Volume 3, written by Roger Bishop in honor of Eleanor Roosevelt, Eleanor said, "They argue about everything in the world, but never tried to influence each other. Each would do, she said, what he or she considered the right thing. And like I mentioned earlier, this is another element that made Eleanor so special in civil rights history, because even though her husband was in office, that did not change her political opinion, and she showed an example of how women can be powerful away from their husband and away from the standard that was applied back then. Radical injustice and women's rights were struggling immensely through this time, which made her movement so powerful. Women were unable to vote, and they were barely allowed to work in any professional field. It was clear how monumental Eleanor's voice was to America when she was elected chair of the United Nations Committee that passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This passage continues to be the most important UN declaration on behalf of basic political freedoms as well as economical and social rights. And like I said, although she was not in office, Mrs. Roosevelt is considered to be the most influential First Lady of all time. She changed the fiber of our society by all of her movements towards human rights. There has been no First Lady who has done such tremendous work. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Eleanor Roosevelt, for the service you have done in America, as we are now much more free to simple rights.